These Africans are hilarious. And sometimes I speak, people think I'm anti-African. I'm pro-African. But I think they're funny when they're like, the black American, it's the no cultural value of the people, they twerk, the girl. And it's like, nah, bro, I've been to more African countries than any African has. And they do the same dances. They try to dress like black men and black women, except they look dirtier. Their wig game is terrible. I mean, utterly terrible. And they're doing all the things we do on dirt roads. So the fact of the matter is you're dealing with a case of jealousy. And I say this with all love for the African peoples. I'll be in Africa shortly. But the fact of the matter is they come to the United States, as do many immigrants, and the dominant culture here is the white culture. And they try their best to step on our heads to appear palatable to the white dominant infrastructure.
So African Americans would say, well, you're not one local. Yes, I know, but I'm walking past my cousin, my nieces every day. So what is in my head is what is in their head. And what I'm explaining is something that they must listen to. When I say there is no such thing as African American culture, they're like, what do you mean? But culture for me is not dance, food, clothing. Those are not cultures. Culture is a worldview. The worldview is what drives people. Their relationship to wealth, to money, to community, to marriage, to family. It's the worldview they have. That's the foundation of a culture. And number two, there is no possibility for you to have a culture without having a language. So if you read most of the books written by brilliant African Americans, the first thing you see, the headline is, the traumatic thing about slavery is not merely changing your environment. The traumatic thing about slavery is not merely asking you to work long hours. The Russians had hard labor camps in Siberia. Many countries, Japanese had it, where people work and they die. The traumatic thing about slavery is one thing only, which everyone has written about. They took our language away. They took our culture away. They took our history and religion away. That is a traumatic thing about being a slave. Now, if they took those things away, how and when were they recovered? So I met a gentleman. I was attending a conference in Singapore, and I met this gentleman who was a Korean sociologist. So we started talking during coffee, and I said, oh, I lived in Korea for 2 years when I was reporting. And he said, oh, wow. And then we started talking. I don't remember how the conversation came about when he asked me. He said, so your country was colonized? I said, yes. And my country, his country, Korea, was colonized by the Japanese for 49 years. And he said, what did you guys, meaning referring to people in Benin, what did you lose as a result of colonization? And I froze and I said, whoa, nobody has ever asked me that question. So I said, Prof, you tell me, and that will give me some idea. And he said, no, we're Koreans, we're colonized by the Japanese. So when they left, all we lost was time. We just went back being Koreans. And from that day, I could tell clearly, what did we lose as a result of colonization in Africa? What did you lose as a result of slavery? If you don't fix that which you lost, you're not going to make any way forward. So in Africa, the countries that exist today were never there. They force a group of tribes that have their own distinct cultures to become a country. So they've lost their distinct cultures, trying to have a culture as a collective, which is never going to happen.
What defines culture? What defines culture? And do we have a culture?
Well, I say this. I believe bro started off wrong off rip, because that's not the denotation of culture. He came up with what his opinion was of it and then tried to say that black people don't have culture. So that's the first ridiculous thing right on there. And then, I'm trying to see the point of what he's really doing, because to me, at this point, I feel like we need to tighten up. And what he's doing is extremely divisive. But I'm going to let y'all go. I got some things on it, but I'm going to let y'all rock into it. But I don't like how he started off.
Yeah. I'd say that, once again, I love when people want to create their own definitions for words that we have definitions for. The definition of culture, just for the crowd, is custom arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular group, nation, people, or other social group. It doesn't require them to have a language. And even if we are to say that language is required for culture to be had or sustained, music is language, music is communication. And there's a strong tie to music in Black American culture. So that would not prove that, when you say like the ability to pass things down from generation to generation, Black Americans have been able to do that through music. So that is a form of language. In addition, there is AAVE, that is also for a dialect in itself, that akin to a lot of Caribbean islands that have a form of dialect derived from English, Spanish, or French. So I think it's very odd to randomly just point out Black Americans and say they don't have culture because they were stolen from their lands, when you wouldn't say that about Jamaicans, and I'm Jamaican. You wouldn't say that about Trinidadians. You wouldn't say that about Bajans. You wouldn't say that about anybody else from the diaspora, but for some reason you want to say that about Black Americans. One last point. He literally disproved everything he said with his last point, where he said, in Africa, there were separate tribes that they forced into countries. So then you're inherently saying that Africans don't have cultures either, because they were forced to put something together that wasn't natural. So pretty much, I guess, no Black people on the planet has a culture.
JR, if you don't mind, I wanted Trev to good morning, first and foremost. I wanted Trev to expound on the divisive aspect. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what was divisive about what he said. To me, it's revealing, right? I think it's good information to see the thought process, because the pathology is very important to understand, so we can see and how you say identify these people who have these notions about so-called Black Americans, But what was divisive in terms of?
By saying you have no culture, right? So what that does is it immediately puts he's on offense, and it puts Black Americans on defense. Why do we have no culture? This is so. In these spaces, there's been a lot of this. I actually addressed it with Dave Anderson, a few weeks ago. We talked about, FBA, non-FBA, and what it is, and people delineating. And one of the main reasons is because of talk like this, right? And in my opinion, I think that every single Black person needs to Voltron, come together. But at this point, people are being divisive. When you push out rhetoric like this against Black Americans, it's going to make people upset. It's going to make them not want to deal with you. It's going to say, all right, well, we're going to do our own thing. We're going to delineate. If you ask my opinion, I would say talk just like this is why Black Americans are saying the hell with y'all.
Okay, I understand, because you're under the premise that we should all be form of Voltron, essentially. Okay, I understand.
Right.
I understand why you're saying that. Then, I think delineation is important, right? I just came back from Barbados, and surprisingly, their culture is very few and far between when you're actually over there. They placate to the white people overwhelmingly that go to the country, right? I was just there, so I'm just going just based on my anecdotal experience. So as an example, if there was 100 people standing outside, 80 of them were baby boomer white people. And so you're literally listening to the music, and it's Barbra Streisand, and it's very old reggae, right? Because they kind of know that Bob Marley stuff, One Love, and etc. As the night moves on, you start to see more Bayesian people out, but even the food, right? It's not distinct, like Aki and saltfish was pretty much the one that's mostly acceptable, was the one in tomato sauce. There wasn't a lot of like even the fish cakes were probably the only distinct thing that they had on the menus. But the best thing they had was steak, right? Because that's what those people are more likely to eat.
Were you
And
in the
so,
tourist area by chance?
Because I was going to say, I was out in Barbados a few years ago, and I know the section you're talking about, and they are absolutely commercialized. And I think that everywhere has a city that's just made for the tourists to feel kind of comfortable, right? So you can kind of segue into the rest of the country if you want to, but that it's meant to make people feel at home. I've actually rode some ATVs a little bit away from there, and I found some other shit. It's different. It's different. They definitely have their own thing going on, but that particular section is a tourist section.
Yeah, if by section you mean several, like more than two, then I agree.
Yeah,
I
it
think
all
that,
depends on how far you went out.
I know, but now I have to go to the ends of the island to find the culture. That still means my point, right? If
No,
I
it
have to
doesn't.
go everywhere, well, just finish this point, right? If I have to go everywhere to find it, it defines what I'm saying, right? Because I can't find it in these distinct and popular areas, you know. And when we're talking to the drivers, they're saying what I'm saying, right? That they placate to the people who essentially fund them. So it wasn't just me coming up with a premise. I used my anecdotal experience being there and then conversing with the drivers. They're saying the same thing, how the East Indian man owns all of it, right? How they're the ones in charge and in control. So these are just the drivers and the people that are helping us kind of confirming what I'm seeing, right? And doesn't feel good, but this is just what I'm seeing out there.
Okay,
Yeah.
real quickly, Pretty, you wanted to respond?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't like that. I don't like the idea of meeting ignorance with ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
That video was highly ignorant, but
Mm-hmm.
your response is also highly ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
When we're speaking about going to a country that literally is on the travel advisory, just about every Black country is on the US travel advisory for level 2 or level 3. So they're already telling people not to travel to those countries.
Mm-hmm.
If those countries depend on tourism, they probably would want to appease the people who would be feeding their economy in some kind of capacity. And because we know that a lot of people are closed-minded, yeah, I'm Jamaican, and as I said, white people show up there and still want hot dogs somehow. So unfortunately, eat your hot dogs. It don't mean that if you drive out and you get out in a grill and now you're in Westmoreland and you're in the other parts that our country isn't there and is strong in the culture. You just have to move out of those areas. So if you were in that area, that really doesn't prove anything. It would be just like me as a Caribbean person. When I first got to the US, I landed in a very Caribbean area and I felt right at home. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the United States doesn't exist and have a very strong Black American culture. If I were to just stay in Miami, I'd say there's no Black American culture. It's all Caribbean stuff here.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be untrue.
100%. And I think that's why I noted the placating, right? I understand that, you know, that the tourism is there, right? Also speaking to the populace that is from there, they were confirming my notion, right? So I think I agree it is ignorance just because I don't know enough, but from my anecdotal experience, that's what I saw. Now, the grills in Jamaica, right? Yeah, and my wife is from Manchester. So I don't have that same notion about Jamaica. So particularly with Barbados, that's what I saw. And I had several conversations because I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. But I don't have that same sentiment regarding Jamaica. So it's not just you know what I mean? I'm not just throwing a blanket over it. But this is what the local people are saying as well.
Go ahead, Saint.
With regard to the discussion about the Franck Zanu character, these Africans are hilarious. And sometimes I speak, people think I'm anti-African. I'm pro-African. But I think they're funny when they're like, the Black American, you know, it's the no cultural value of the people, they twerk the girl. And it's like, nah, bro, I've been to more African countries than any African has. And they do the same dances. They try to dress like Black men and Black women, except they look dirtier. Their wig game is terrible. I mean, utterly terrible. And they're doing all the things we do on dirt roads. So the fact of the matter is you're dealing with a case of jealousy. And I say this with all love for the African peoples. I'll be in Africa shortly. But the fact of the matter is they come to the United States, as do many immigrants, and the dominant culture here is the white culture. And they try their best to step on our heads to appear palatable to the white dominant infrastructure. Now, here's the thing that's worth noting, and I agree with Pretty Intellectual about this fellow starts trying to redefine words, which is extraordinary. Is he a linguist or a cultural anthropologist? I don't know what his background is, except that he's a journalist who's worked for the white man. And so we know who's feeding him. He's not an entrepreneur. He's never been in control of his own life. And furthermore, he's so African and respects their culture so much that he lives in Texas and he dresses like a white man. So the thing that I often put forward to these Africans is like, look here, little buddy. If your culture is so strong, why'd you throw it away so quickly? The reason that he has to redefine culture away from the traditional markers, he mentioned language, for sure. Okay. But then what about folkways, mores, religion, garb, style of dress, holidays, all of these things? Well, he had to throw that away because if you look at his appearance, he's dressed like a Western white man. So you'd have to ask him, well, in my case, as a foundational Black American, that was ripped from me. I never had a choice on that. Our culture started here as an ethnic group. You decided to throw away your culture. You voluntarily threw it into the garbage can. So how strong could it be? Here's the most important thing that no one acknowledges. When a culture is so strong, so emulated, so good that it's commercialized, packaged, and sold around the whole world, it becomes invisible because it's dominant. You go to China, you mention any of the Michaels, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Mike Tyson, they know who you're talking about. You go to Albania, you look like Tupac. They couldn't name anyone of meaning from Africa, the whole damn 54 countries. So my point is this: our culture is extraordinarily dominant. Our culture is well known, the good and the bad. There's a such thing as high culture and there's a such thing as low culture. High culture, maybe we talk about Ella Fitzgerald. Maybe we talk about Martin Delaney. Low culture, maybe we talk about Sexy Red. But the level of domination is extraordinary. So he's a lying, dirty, filthy African who's a pseudo-intellectual, and he's destructive for Black people wherever you find them. He is a tool, a bootlicker of the white supremacists, and he doesn't even know it. And that's the sad part. I yield the floor.
Go ahead, Kiana.
So I feel from his perspective that the lack of appreciation for a culture does not denote that it is not a culture. Just because he is from Africa and feels as though his culture is superior to ours, you also have to look at the whole concept that cultures are built over time. So if we're uprooted from a place, brought to another place, and in the stages of developing our culture, it may not be as sound as their culture that's been not tinkered with as much as ours has. We have a culture, they just don't appreciate what that is. They may look at certain things, especially with media being representative of what Black culture is, and is typically a very terrible description of what it is quite often. They're looking at it from the perspective of Black culture as living in the hood, or just things that are not positive aspects, and that lack of appreciation for the things that we do and appreciate and we live every single day. He's not going to value that, but that does not denote that we do not have a culture.
Go ahead, True.
Yeah, I find it interesting because it seems to be that we are attacking the man's origin and lineage instead of being a little bit more open-minded. I think we're being kind of intellectually dishonest. I definitely appreciate Kiana's response because I think that it was probably the most balanced and sound. And this is why I say I believe we're being intellectually dishonest. Worldview was a good definition, in my opinion, because there's probably no place where people derive from a certain, a region of the world, that when they're perceiving the world, their culture is the dictator of how they see the world. We talk about, from an American perspective, that media, because we have such a media eye, and I talked about this the last time, that is a part of American culture. But this is the only country that is built the way it's built. It has a subset of people deriving from all different parts of the world. And we get to blend, perspective, personas, and different things alike. But when we talk about us as a group, Americans struggle, Black Americans struggle to be able to convey what is our culture. Language is a part of culture. Garb is not necessarily, you don't have a trademark on garb because cotton is cotton, jeans are jeans, suits are suits. And so this is where I found this particular interview to be interesting, because he was giving his perspective. And what I've heard from just a few people is the fact that he's African seems to aggravate people. And I'm not sure why. because I believe that the fact that he does come from a different region of the world, it gives him a different outlook from outside of what we typically see. So we're going to have this conversation. I would like it to be hopefully a little bit more honest, moving forward. And I'll land.
Anybody like to respond? Go ahead, Saint, and then Pretty.
No, it's important to address that he's African. In fact, he's from a small, irrelevant country called Benin, which is actually one of my more favored governments in Africa. It's in West Africa next to Nigeria, which makes it strategically important. I think the population is something like 13 million, so it's largely irrelevant. I think it has like 75 miles of coastline, not significant natural resources as cotton and a couple other things. But it's really interesting because it's one of the few places that actually does give consideration to the those who have been a victim of the Ma'afa, which we today call the foundational Black American. However, they recently suffered a coup, which was short-lived, which is an indicator of instability politically. And more importantly, you look at their economy, it's atrocious. They're run by like the Black Donald Trump, which is to say like a guy who's really successful in business, and he went into office and he inched up the economy, but they're still struggling significantly. If you look at good examples in the African continent of Black countries, you look at like Botswana, even Ethiopia is doing all right. This country is what you would for sure describe as backward. And it's important when someone attempts to establish themselves as coming from a high culture to look at where they actually come from. I do know precisely where he comes from. It's not an impressive place. And what we will continue to do, similar to those people who have that flag that's blue and white, we will be a proud people and we will defend any attacks that come upon us. And it's not to be divisive, it's to be defensive. We're going to defend, rightfully so, because what you'll find from their good example of those people who have that country they recently established in the Middle East is when you're constantly making sure that people know if they attack, you will defend, you will kill an ant with a sledgehammer, people are less inclined to attack. And it's important that we defend our cultural icons, our way of life. And we do, in fact, have a way of life. When he talks about language, because he's unsophisticated, he forgets to talk about dialect. The Black American has such an extraordinary dialect. You can go to the Czech Republic and you can hear people speaking in our English. They're not speaking mainstream English colloquially to each other. They're speaking the English of the Black American. Our culture is hugely influential. Are there detrimental parts? Absolutely. But we also can speak to the fact that we created rock and roll, we created jazz music, we created doo-wop, we created R&B, we created hip hop, and the list goes on longer than that. And then we can talk about our inventors. We can talk about people who are still living, who are legends like Dr. Ben Carson, who pioneered a method in separating occipitally conjoined craniospagus twins without them insanguinating. We are legendary. So no, you will not reduce our culture, especially when you come from a backwater that even compared to African countries is fairly despicable. And we don't talk to degrade you. We talk to just establish what is real. You guys are living in a backwater. And if the Black American were a nation, they'd have about $1 to $2 trillion in spending power. They'd be in the top 15 of countries on the planet Earth. So we will demand the respect that is due to us. And even despite saying all of that, I still have SAS in Africa, where we work on a couple fundamental things, one of which is ideology. The reason you have a guy like this Frank guy is because it's an ideology issue. It's a lack of respect for the self. And in him degrading us, he degrades himself. But we won't tolerate it. I yield the floor.